She was captured by Vikings the night the tide turned. The last thing she tasted was salt and smoke. The last thing she heard for hours was the pounding of oars and the creak of timber, the ragged rhythm of a world being ripped from its moorings. A girl of 17, standing with bare feet in the mud of a burned lane, watched men she had only ever seen from a distance move through her village like a storm. They came fast, sliding long ships onto the strand before dawn, cutting down roofs and dragging people, children, elders, women, toward boats that could slip up rivers and steal inland under the shadow of trees. Her wrists were bound. Her name is not recorded. She is not an individual in the archive, but a representative of many. Her silence has a voice. Hers was not an isolated atrocity. It was part of an organized commercial system in which human beings were treated as inventory, transported, sold, and put to work. This is the central claim of what follows. The Viking Age raids, already famous for their speed and violence, were only one layer of a broader enterprise. Raiding financed slaving, slaving financed settlement, trade, and political power. The capture of that 17-year-old, and of women like her across coasts from the Irish Sea to the Baltic, was economically calculated, legally codified, socially normalized. She was taken not merely to be killed or to be used for a season of labor. She was transported into a network of markets, households, and institutions that converted human lives into long-term commodity and status. What happens to that girl on board the ship, how she is counted, carried, catalogued, and parceled out, is worse in a slow institutional sense than the moment of violence that took her from home. To understand this, we need to move from the shock of the raid to the mechanics that made such raids effective and profitable, then to the legal and social frameworks that turned capture into property, and finally to the archaeological, textual, and genetic traces that let us reconstruct the lived experience of captives. First, the ships. The images most people remember are long, low hulls with dragon heads. Drakkar is a later name often used in modern popular culture to refer to those long ships, but the technical point is this: a shallow draft, flexible hull designed for speed and surprise. These vessels could be beached almost anywhere, turn quickly, and slide up rivers where larger ships could not follow. That mobility allowed raiding parties to strike monasteries and isolated settlements that seemed safe from the sea. The shallow keel made it possible to steal whole villages before dawn. A single stroke of a paddle could mean 1,000 miles of new market for human cargo. This was not casual theft. Financing a longship, provisioning a crew, and maintaining a fleet required resources. Contemporary annals and later sagas point to an investment model. Raiders expected returns. Monasteries, wealthy farms, and isolated hamlets were targeted because of their accumulated goods and human capital. The annals of Ulster and other Irish chronicles repeatedly record raids, with references to large numbers of captives taken. While medieval chroniclers may exaggerate at times, the pattern is clear. Captives were taken systematically, women and children as well as men, because they could be sold or put to labor. The economics were crude but effective. One successful raid could underwrite a fleet, and captive labor increased household productivity and prestige. This brings us to language and law, because what makes exploitation durable is legal recognition. In Norse sources, the word thrall appears again and again. Thrall meant slave or bondservant, a legally defined category. The Icelandic Grágás law code, compiled and written down several centuries after the early raids but reflecting legal traditions, records how thralls might be bought and sold, how their testimony was treated, and how their labor and bodies were considered property. Under such codes, a thrall could not ordinarily give testimony in court, and their personhood under law was circumscribed. To be made a thrall was to be reclassified within a system that had rules for ownership. In law, she stopped being a person and became inventory. The legal definition mattered in practical terms. It structured everyday power. Who could command labor? Who could claim children born of concubinage? Who could demand fines, and who could live free? Where the law allowed owners to control marriage, movement, and reproduction, the social consequences multiplied across generations. Men and women who were captured, sometimes to be ransomed, sometimes to be worked, sometimes to be integrated into domestic life, now existed under a regime that normalized their exploitation. Now consider the logistics of transportation and market exchange. Being taken in a raid was only the first step in a long chain. Captives were marched, often tied together or herded with animals, to the shore, loaded onto ships in cramped conditions, and then carried to coastal hubs that functioned as markets. Places like Dublin, Dyflin in Ireland, Birka on the Swedish lake system, and Ribe in Denmark acted as nodal points in a network that reached from Dublin to Constantinople and Baghdad. These were not isolated marketplaces but parts of long-distance commercial systems linking the north to the broader world. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat traveling in the 10th century, recorded seeing Rus traders, Norsemen who operated in the river routes to the east, at a marketplace. He noted scenes in which women were displayed and traded, and he described the mixture of commerce and ceremony that accompanied high-status funerals. One short image from his account reads like a stage direction in a foreign drama. There were women who were sold, and beside them, people who valued them as commodities. His outsider's eye is mediated by cultural distance and rhetorical purpose, yet his testimony is striking because it is a contemporaneous outsider's record of slave trade practices in the Viking world. Markets were not only about sale, they were about evaluation and classification. Merchants assessed captives for age, health, and perceived skills, textile work, household labor, or potential as concubines attracted different prices. Buyers included farmers wanting domestic servants, elite households wanting concubines or household laborers, and long-distance traders who shipped captives to the Islamic world, where slaves commanded high prices. The routes to Constantinople and Baghdad were real and documented. Ivory, silks, and human beings moved along the same channels. If you imagine the voyage itself, you should picture overcrowded conditions. Ships that had been engineered for speed were not comfortable for human cargo. Skeletal evidence and isotopic analysis from burial sites show that many who ended up in Norse households experienced changes in diet and health consistent with lower status living. Dental markers, bone development, and signs of repetitive labor in skeletons indicate strenuous domestic work. Grinding grain, hauling water, weaving. Women's labor was central to domestic production. Textile manufacturing in particular was a labor-intensive process that supported household economies. The archaeological record, spindle whorls concentrated in certain contexts, wear patterns on bones, residues in domestic structures, corroborates textual descriptions that link captives to specific kinds of work. We should pause to be careful. When we move from law and markets to lived experience, the sources are uneven. Sagas, often composed centuries after events, present literary pictures colored by later social norms. Law codes, written down in Iceland after settlement, reflect a juridical system that had evolved. Still, when law, archaeology, isotopic data, and contemporary observers like Ibn Fadlan point in a similar direction, the overall picture becomes compelling. That is why historians speak of patterns rather than isolated incidents. Multiple lines of evidence converge on a system in which human beings, especially women, were trafficked, traded, and put to work. If this picture is unsettling, that the Viking Age was not merely a series of violent episodes, but a market-driven system of human commerce, then this next point should drive the thought deeper. The ordinary life of a captive in a Norse household was defined by unfreedom. She could be assigned to grind grain from dawn to dusk, to tend to livestock, to weave by lamplight. The archaeological signature of these tasks appears again and again. Elevated levels of muscle attachment on bones indicative of repetitive stress, osteoarthritis in predictable patterns, and diet signatures in isotopic composition that suggest staple diets of barley and limited animal protein compared to free households. These physical traces align with textual statements that thralls were considered domestic resources. Gender shaped these experiences. Men taken in raids might be put to labor, sold to fight, or ransomed. Women were often channeled into domestic spaces, household labor, textile production, and sexual servitude. Sexual exploitation needs to be addressed carefully. Trigger warning. In the next section, I will describe practices of sexual servitude and ritual violence. This material is presented in restrained, factual language. Sexual servitude often appeared as a normal part of household ownership. Captive women could become concubines, a status recognized in sagas and legal contexts, with children born into ambiguous positions of social standing. Contemporary legal and narrative sources indicate that the sexual availability of a thrall was often treated as an owner's right. Rape in that context functioned as an assertion of property more than an assault in the modern legal sense. That phrasing is clinical because these actions were embedded in legal and social structures that denied captives control. The children of such unions had variable status. Some could be integrated into households, gaining manumission over generations. Others remain legally subordinate. Sagas record manumission in some cases. Runestones record men freeing thralls, but those are selective glimpses. The physical evidence, including skeletal markers showing interrupted growth or dietary stress in female remains, suggests a population whose health was disproportionately affected by exploitation and constrained nutrition. Ritual killing, the extreme endpoint of sanctioned violence, is perhaps the most harrowing element in the documentary record. Ibn Fadlan's account describes a funeral on the Volga where a high-status woman, some scholars read her as a concubine or ritual victim, was ritually killed and buried as part of the funeral rites of a chieftain. His description, vivid and moralizing from his perspective, includes details of strangulation, offerings, and the burial of a woman beside a dead man, with attendants sacrificed to accompany him into the afterlife. Archaeology in places like Oseberg and certain graves in Sweden and Russia has produced burials where multiple individuals, some likely non-voluntary, were interred together, sometimes with signs of violent death. Be careful. Interpretation is contested. Some graves reflect complex funerary practices rather than straightforward sacrifice. Others are ambiguous and debated. When multiple independent sources, textual description, and certain burial patterns point toward the existence of ritual victimization, the evidence should be taken seriously while preserving scholarly caution about how common such practices were. Beyond these immediate experiences, we see the long-term effects of this system in demography and genetics. Iceland provides a particularly striking case because of its combination of early settlement records and modern genetic analysis. Historical material suggests that Norse settlers arrived in Iceland with a mix of Scandinavian men and women from the British Isles. Genetic studies focusing on mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is inherited maternally, show a disproportionate contribution from British and Irish maternal lineages. That pattern indicates that many of the women who contributed to Icelandic ancestry came from the British Isles. The methodological strength here is that mtDNA provides a clear window into maternal ancestry. Its distribution cannot be explained by later small-scale migration alone, and implies a significant movement of women into Norse settler communities. What explains that movement? Several mechanisms are possible: voluntary migration, arranged marriages, and the coercive abduction of women during raids. The evidence does not point to a single cause in every case, but the combination of historical accounts of raiding and capturing, saga narratives that include women taken in war and brought to new homelands, and the demographic signature in the genetics all tilt the balance toward the interpretation that abduction and forced movement of women played a significant role in settlement patterns. That does not erase agency in every instance. Some women may have chosen to stay, some may have been integrated through childbearing or local alliances. But it does complicate any benign narrative of settlement as purely consensual movement. Runestones and legal inscriptions provide additional documentary traces. Certain runestones commemorate the freeing of thralls or make reference to people taken during raids and later ransomed. These stones are selective. They are monuments erected by those who could afford to commemorate. But they reveal what contemporaries thought worth recording: ransom, manumission, and the ownership of thralls as a sign of status. Even in examples where individuals are freed, the practice of owning thralls was widespread enough to be legally and socially significant. We need to confront another common myth: the romanticized warrior colonist who peacefully settles abroad with a homestead and family. The archaeological and documentary record shows that settlement often depended on networks of violence, forced migration, and labor exploitation. The foundation of some communities included the presence of individuals who had been enslaved, and in some cases, the social structures of these settlements institutionalized those inequalities. That has consequences for how we interpret artifacts and the material culture of the Viking Age. Objects bought with slave labor or produced by captive hands are part of the archaeological record, and we should not separate beauty or technical skill from the social relations that produce them. How did people of the time reckon with these realities? The answers are mixed. Some sources suggest moral discomfort. Christian writers, for instance, criticized certain practices, but Christianity did not automatically end slaveholding. In northern legal codes, including elements later recorded in Gragas, slavery persisted even as social and legal structures evolved. Manumission occurred, and thralls sometimes secured freedom or had their status improved. In other instances, slavery appeared to be a stable institution for generations. The practice of buying and freeing thralls, of ransoming captives, and of integrating selected individuals into households reveals a complex social negotiation rather than uniform cruelty or uniform benevolence. Return for a moment to our 17-year-old. What became of girls like her? There is no single answer. Some were sold to households in the same region. Others were transported across the sea to foreign lands where they might live out their lives in servitude or, in some cases, gradually be absorbed into families. A fraction might be ransomed back to relatives if they were valuable enough. Noble women could be held as political hostages and used to negotiate alliances. Yet many disappeared from the documentary record. Their bodies or goods might be later found in graves that now provide pale shadows of their lives. Bone chemistry altered by diet, traces of repetitive labor on their skeletons, grave goods placed by a household that claimed them in life and death. We should not collapse this into a single narrative of victimhood without nuance. Some captives found forms of integration. Their descendants contributed to new communities, and in certain cases, former thralls rose in status. But to emphasize isolated stories of mobility and integration without acknowledging the legal and systemic mechanisms of exploitation is to whitewash the broader structure that made those few exceptions possible. There is an ethical dimension to how we remember this past. We like stories of exploration and heroism. We like to imagine noble seafarers charting unknown seas. That image is part of the Viking mythos. But myths can obscure structural realities. The same technology that enabled exploration enabled plunder. The same ships that carried traders brought human cargo. The same social systems that organized communities accepted, codified, and profited from slavery. The romantic image of Vikings as purely adventurous seafarers must be balanced with evidence of how expansion often rested on exploitation. What then should be our takeaways? First, evidence points consistently toward the Viking Age as a period in which the capture and sale of human beings was systematic and economically meaningful. Legal terms like thrall and sources like the Gragas show how such status was formalized. Contemporary observers like Ibn Fadlan provide eyewitness accounts that humanize market practices and record ritual extremes. Archaeology and bioarchaeology, burial patterns, isotopic data, skeletal markers, give us material traces of the lived experiences of captives. Genetic studies, especially using maternal lineages in Iceland, reveal demographic patterns consistent with large-scale movement of women from the British Isles into Norse settler communities. These diverse lines of evidence converge. They do not merely suggest isolated violence, but indicate an organized system of human traffic and domestic exploitation. Second, the gendered dimension is crucial. Women often experience capture in ways that converted them into household laborers and sexual property. Their bodies were sites of economic use, their children might be instruments of integration, and their legal status was typically subordinate. That pattern has long-term demographic and cultural consequences that we can detect centuries later. Third, when we study the past, we owe victims an accurate account rather than a sanitized myth. To acknowledge systemic brutality does not deny technical or cultural achievements. It contextualizes them. The longships were engineering feats. Norse navigation was skillful, yet technical accomplishment should not be allowed to eclipse moral accountability. Recognizing how slavery underpinned parts of Viking expansion changes the narratives we tell about the past and has implications for how we interpret artifacts, settlement patterns, and lineage stories. Finally, this history has modern reverberations. How societies remember formidable ancestors affects identity and how communities market themselves. Romantic myths of noble explorers can be mobilized to hide past wrongs. Revisiting these narratives with a careful, evidence-based approach is not an exercise in blame for contemporary people. It is an attempt to understand complexity, to honor those whose lives were erased or commodified, and to practice a historically honest imagination. If this investigation has spoken to you, and you want more deep dives into history's darker truths, subscribe and stay with this channel for carefully sourced episodes that peel back familiar myths. Before we close, consider the long shadow that the unnamed girl's capture casts. Her life, like those of many others, was shaped by a system that turned mobility into market and made legality a tool of dehumanization. The ruins we study, the runestones we read, the bones we analyze, and the empty DNA we sequence all point to lives rearranged by force and commerce. To say that what happened to her was worse than anyone imagined is not to sensationalize her pain, but to insist on the structural cruelty beneath the dramatic moment of abduction. She was not only stripped of freedom in the chaos of a raid, she was moved into an economic and legal system that normalized her reduction to property. History is a conversation between evidence and interpretation. When that conversation includes law codes, written eyewitnesses, archaeological traces, and the very biology of modern populations, it becomes harder to keep the bright, gilded myths unexamined. The Viking past, with all its technical brilliance and cultural complexity, also carried systems of exploitation that shaped lives for generations. The 17-year-old who tasted salt and smoke may not appear on a runestone, but her trace exists in the practices and institutions that allowed and profited from her capture. There are practical ways to follow up if you want to read deeper. Look into the Irish annals for entries about coastal raids. Read Ibn Fadlan's account for a contemporary outsider perspective. Consult Gragas for the legal sense of thrall status, and explore recent bioarchaeological and genetic studies on Norse burials and Icelandic mtDNA. These sources let you track how the story is built from many kinds of evidence. To close, the next time you see a dramatic image of a dragon-headed ship cutting the horizon, remember the people whose bodies filled its holds. The same vessels that carried warriors also carried women whose lives were converted into labor and lineage by a system of commerce and law. Remembering that complexity is an ethical act, it restores faces to history and insists that technical achievement be weighed against the human costs that made it possible. If you found this investigation valuable, please like, share, and check the description for further reading and a playlist of related episodes exploring myth and evidence in other historical contexts. Tell us in the comments which historical myth you think needs a re-examination next. We'll take the most requested and dig into the sources.